All right, in this video, we'll be looking at the concepts of micro and macroevolution, just a very general overview on these topics. For a much broader treatment on these topics, I would suggest other videos that I have, probably like units in AP biology or biology, honors biology. But for this class, we're just going to kind of keep it simple, since so much of this class is talking about where animals came from and how they kind of got to the place that they're at today. So just a real quick overview of Darwinian evolution. Remember, Darwin took a voyage, Charles Darwin, in the 1830s around the globe, and he saw a bunch of things like different species. He noticed that species that live over here in Indonesia in the rainforest have similar characteristics as species that live over here in the rainforest. And so he thought, okay, there has to be a link here. Perhaps environmental pressures in both places are causing or making these animals, same kind of selection pressures will lead to the same kinds of traits over time. And so if he took that along with the fossil evidence that he gathered and came to the conclusions that animals will be uniquely adapted for the environment that they live in because they have changed over time to meet the environmental demands. And he published those findings in a book. It's a pretty important book called The Origin of Species, or On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or, and you see this long big title. And so, very important book in science in particular, or in science in general, and in biology in particular. Almost all biological sciences are lean on these ideas at some level, even though our understanding of evolution change over time has changed over time. All right, one thing that Darwin came up with and dealt with was this concept of homologous structures, which is just basically the idea that families of animals will share structures, and those structures, though they seem similar, have very different functions. And so you can see here, these are all mammalian forearms, except for this. This is a bird, but it has some similar kinds of structures to it. And you can see that the forearms, even though a human arm is used differently than a whale arm or maybe a cat arm here, they still have very similar structures and show a link in relation. And modern revisions concerning evolutionary thought have to do with our understanding of DNA, our understanding of the way allele frequency influences popular changes in allele frequency influence populations. These are things Darwin didn't know about, that was still undiscovered and still learning about as science was figuring those things out. All right, so microevolution. This is just a series of small changes that can lead to the creation of new breeding populations. So you can see here, this is kind of just a really simple understanding of evolution. You have one species here, mutation creates variation. Some of those variations aren't favorable, others are. More mutations do that, and you kind of get, from this original species, you end up with something that's completely different, just based on mutation, based on some mutations being favorable, some not. It's a simple process. It's not because this animal didn't want to live and these decided they wanted to. Had nothing to do with the animal's decisions. It had to do with their genes, and the best genes are always going to win out. Natural selection is not a random process. The survival of the fittest wins, and the fittest kind of carries on its genes to the next generation. However, there is this concept of genetic equilibrium. Genetic equilibrium suggests that there are conditions available that would prevent a population from changing over time. Those conditions, don't know if I have them listed. I don't have them listed, so that's okay. So we will just talk about them here. There are 5 conditions. 2 scientists, Hardy-Weinberg, came up with this, and they called this Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And they said that these conditions have to be present, and these conditions are there can be no mutations in the population, there can be no natural selection, meaning that one animal is not better at a thing than another animal, or the resources aren't limited at all. There can be no migration, so nothing is moving into and out of a population. There's random mating, meaning that one mate is not more desirable than another mate for a particular reason. And there has to be a very large population. There has to be a very large population because changes in smaller populations are easily detectable. And so this shows you, this graph here shows you how changes in allele frequency are measured, and Hardy-Weinberg's theorem, and that is beyond the scope of this class, so we're not going to go into that, but it does show you how changes in allele frequency can show a change in population over time, which is just basically evolution. And so that's what this is talking about. A change in allele frequency is just essentially evolution. That's kind of how that works. And here's this Hardy-Weinberg equation. Again, I'm not going to have you guys know this for this class, but it is a way to mathematically calculate whether or not evolution is occurring. If evolution is not occurring, that is called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and it needs those 5 things that we talked about earlier. If those conditions aren't met, then a population will change over time. Now, that leads us to the concept of macroevolution. And macroevolution has to do with large scale type events. All right, so it has to do with changes that lead to the creation of new species, changes that lead to the creation of whole new categories, or like when the dinosaurs died, for instance, mammals were around, but not to the extent that they are today. It was more ruled by reptiles, so there was this drastic change. So we would say that is a macroevolution type event. Macroevolution is typically tied to mass extinction. Because of mass extinction, multiple niches become available, and creatures, those niches will get exploited by creatures, and they will adapt to fill those niches over time, just because it's easier to get food and it's easier to serve in a niche that is not being used. And so you see when all these large reptiles went extinct after the impact event, then many large mammals came on the scene over the course of millions of years because they filled those niches that the large reptiles left behind. And so just a quick note on the rate of evolutionary change. Evolutionary history represents really long periods of gradual change. And so you have this kind of picture here is what we'd like to think of when we think of evolution. In that other picture that I showed you with the dots, may have demonstrated that, but in reality what we have going on is we have these long periods of gradual or no change at all, like stasis, and then we have these really rapid times of change following some sort of extinction level event, and it causes those niches to become available.